I now have the lathe correctly set up with my new mounting stud and the correct 3D printed gears here to allow me to cut a 16 TPI thread. I have the lathe all set up to do that. I didn't have a gauge, one of these little fishtail gauges, which is what you use to make sure your tool is set to the correct angle and that the tool is set correctly to the work. The one I have here is set to 60 degrees, but because I'm cutting Whitworth threads, I needed a 55-degree one, and I don't have one, so I just quickly 3D printed a little gauge I could use, and I have some metal ones on order. But the lathe's all now set up to cut those threads, and I actually cut a test thread, which is a 1/2 inch BSF thread in a piece of aluminium bar. When I cut the proper stud, of course, it's going to be in steel, but I wanted to make sure I had everything set up and that it was actually going to work. And that worked really well. The one thing I have to do on this lathe is I don't have a threading indicator. I'm looking at building one, so that means 3D printing more gears and building a little housing and the little dial. But because I don't have one on my lathe, I need to engage the half nut and then leave it engaged. So that basically means you run the tool across to start cutting the thread. When you get to the end, you have to stop the lathe, bring the tool back with the cross slide, reverse the lathe to send the tool back in that direction, and then go back to your 0 position on the cross slide, advance the tool slightly with the top slide, and then do your next pass. And you just keep repeating that until your full thread is cut. It takes a little while and it's a bit fiddly, but it worked fine. That thread, obviously, that's to make up this mounting stud for the gearbox. I need to get some suitable steel so I can machine this up. But as I mentioned, that's a BSF thread. And in one of my earlier films, I did mention having to buy the correct hardware, the nuts and bolts from the UK, and that was going to be quite expensive. And a friend of mine asked me, well, why do you have to buy those expensive bolts from the UK? If you need a 1/4 inch bolt, can't you just use any 1/4 inch bolt? And the answer to that is, well, yes, you could, but to be correct, I have to use Whitworth and BSF hardware because it's a 1930s car. And the reason you have to use those particular bolts comes down to spanners, basically. This takes a little bit of explaining. I won't go into too much of the details, but basically, obviously you have imperial fasteners and you have metric fasteners. Now, I can't use metric because, of course, all the holes in the mounting brackets and things are all going to be imperial sizes. So that just leaves imperial hardware. And when it comes to the imperial stuff, there's the old British standards. There's the BSF and the Whitworth threads. And you also have the US spec stuff, so the UNF and the UNC. So what I have here is a selection of things that I can sort of use to demonstrate this. So I'm just going to call all of these bolts, even though that's not technically correct. But if I just say nuts and bolts, everyone knows what I'm talking about. So what I have here are 4 different 1/4 inch bolts, and the 1/4 inch is, of course, the size of the hole that the bolt goes through, the size of the shaft. So we can actually see, if I measure these are all 1/4 inch. Now, there are differences in the thread, obviously how fine the thread is. There are differences in the angles of the thread and the form of the thread. That's all detail that you can look up. The biggest difference is in the way the spanners work. So these 1/4 inch British bolts, you need to use a 1/4 inch British spanner. So you can see on here that's marked 1/4 BSF, and you'll see that fits the nut or the bolt head. Now, these bolts, being American, are measured differently. So in this case, the the spanner you use is worked out by the size of the nut. It's a bit hard to see on 1/4 inch because the size difference isn't that big. But if we look at these, this is a 3/8 BSF bolt, so a British bolt, and this is a 3/8 UNF, US style bolt. On the 3/8 British bolt, you use a 3/8 BSF spanner, and you can see that spanner fits the bolt head and the nut. It will fit over the UNF one, but it's loose. You can see it rattles around a lot. For the American style bolts, and this also works for metric bolts as well, the size of the spanner is related to the size of the nut or the head of the bolt. So even though this is a 3/8 bolt, I have to use a 9/16 AF spanner. And the AF refers to across the flats. So that's that size there. And you can see that if I can get it to go on, that fits that nicely. And the same with the nut. This spanner, AF spanner, won't fit the BSF bolt. You see it's the bolt head is too big. It just won't fit at all. As I mentioned, it's similar on metric hardware. So this is an 8mm metric bolt, but you need a 13mm spanner because that's the size of the nut or the head of the bolt. It gets a little bit more complicated with Whitworth threads. You can see here, the spanner actually has two measurements marked on it. It's got 5/16 Whitworth and 3/8 BSF. And that's because the original Whitworth bolts, these coarse threaded ones, the size of the nut or the size of the head of the bolt was actually bigger on the Whitworth threaded ones. So this 1/4 inch one, if it was an earlier Whitworth thing, the size of that head would be bigger. And I believe that changed around World War II. It might have been a austerity measure when they were trying to save materials, but they sort of standardized and they made all of the Whitworth profile bolts, so the BSF and the BSW, have the same nuts, same size. So that's why you see these spanners with two measurements on them, but usually you find the heads are going to be the same size whether or not they're Whitworth or BSF. I don't think I've come across a Whitworth bolt with the bigger size head yet. I might have some in a junk box somewhere, but they don't seem as common. So that's pretty much the reason why I need to use BSF and Whitworth, because this is a 1930s car and it needs to be made using the parts and materials of the time. And also anyone who's working on that car will be expecting to be using a certain set of tools on it. So BSF and BSW type spanners. It's very annoying if you're working on a pre-war or a vintage car and you find it's got metric hardware and things like that. You don't have the right tools to be able to work on that car. So I want to keep this as good a replica as I can, so that means using the correct hardware and the correct tooling.